Okay, this is Najee, Black Art in America. We're here with Dr. Richard Long again. Dr. Long, you're going to give a lecture on Paris museums in New Orleans, and we got a few questions we love to ask. Uh, when are you going to be in New Orleans?
Well, these lectures, or it's one lecture, is scheduled for November 18th. The lecture will be given for the program in museum studies at SUNO. SUNO is Southern University in New Orleans. And the program there is directed by a friend and former student of mine, Dr. Sarah Hollis. And in our conversation, it was decided that I could come there and perhaps do a lecture on my favorite museum city, namely Paris. And so that's when and where I will be in New Orleans.
Okay, and why Paris?
Well, Paris, of course, I have been going to for decades, and the center of my activity in Paris is visiting museums. And of course, I visited, on my very first visit to Paris, I went directly to the Louvre, and it's very seldom I go there since then that I don't go to the Louvre, but I also go to dozens of other art museums there in Paris.
Okay. What museums in Paris will you be talking about?
Well, this lecture is specifically on museums in Paris which are dedicated to single artists. And among those museums, there are quite a few of them. Among those museums, I will be talking specifically about the Rodin Museum, devoted to the great sculptor, the Monet Museum, devoted to the famous Impressionist painter, and the Picasso Museum, devoted to the leading artists of the 20th century.
Okay. And is African art represented in the Paris museums?
Yeah, that's a very interesting subject, which I think probably requires an essay. The art from Africa was included in the Ethnographical Museum in Paris in the 19th century, along with art from various other areas which were being studied by the anthropologists. And one fascinating thing about the art, African art, which was in the Ethnographical Museum, is that in the early 20th century, Pablo Picasso visited the museum and was very much taken up by the challenges, formal challenges of African art that he saw there. And that helped create Cubism. His response to that art created Cubism. So the African art in museums in Paris does have an impact on painting throughout the Western world following Picasso's discovery. However, the Ethnographical Museum, the name was eventually changed to the Musée de l'Homme, and that was there in Paris from 1937 on in the museum, or rather in the huge building which had been built for the fair exposition of 1937. In the 1960s, a special museum focusing on art from the Pacific and art from Africa, was created in Paris. And this was perhaps the museum that most people interested in African art would go to. Some years ago, an event occurred where somebody had a great impact upon the President of the Republic, and they came up with a proposal to create a museum which again would focus on the art from Africa and from the Pacific and from other parts of the world which had previously been studied primarily by anthropologists. And this museum exists today. It's called the Musée du Quai Branly. That simply means it's on the coast on the side of the Seine at what they call the Quai Branly. And that's a very large and very controversial museum in Paris, but it does contain enormous amounts of African sculpture, which indeed was raided from these two other museums. Indeed, one of those museums closed, and the other one is sort of in, Musée de l'Homme is sort of in transit now. However, over 10 years ago, in anticipation of the Musée du Quai Branly, the people who were involved in it were able to get several pieces, maybe 100 pieces from it, 100 spectacular pieces, and they were put on view at the Louvre. Even though you can go to the Louvre now and maybe not be aware of it, and most people go to the Louvre aren't aware of it, but actually you can actually see African art along with art from the Pacific and other places at the Louvre now, and that has been so for the last 10 years. Now, in addition to that, about 20 years ago, a private museum devoted to African art called the Musée d'Aper was created. And this is a relatively small museum, but exclusively devoted to African art. And that, of course, has been on the scene for people in Paris for quite a while. In addition to that, of course, ever since the 1920s, there have been galleries which were either devoted to African art or which dealt with African art, at least as part of the things that they dealt with. And the most important of these at the very beginning was the gallery owned by a man who was the contact with Albert Barnes. So the Barnes Foundation, of course, does include art, and it was bought in Paris in the 1920s from this dealer who also dealt with contemporary art, with some of the other art that Barnes bought.
Wow. And I guess one of the final questions I would have, what about the work of the African diaspora? Will you find their work in the museums and even the galleries?
Well, not really in museums to any extent, and I would say that the African diaspora art, which may have had the largest impact in Paris, would be the popular art from Haiti. That, of course, there were always contacts between Haiti and France. So as early as the 50s and 60s, there were galleries in Paris which handled some Haitian art. And there was a major show of Haitian art at the so-called Grand Palais in Paris about 20-some years ago. So that is one element that's known. A gallery which closed recently, which opened in '68, is a gallery opened by an American woman, Dorothea Speyer, and she was very close to my friend Delaney, Buford Delaney, and she has handled his work, off and on throughout those years, and indeed quite recently, since her gallery closed, they had a huge auction to get rid of the things, and several Delaney's were in that. Another artist whom she handled was Sam Gilliam, who is still very, very active, and so on, and several of his things went on auction earlier this year when they closed the Dorothea Speyer Gallery. And then I should mention a gallery which has been in business for almost 20 years in Paris, run by Laurent Chocot. The gallery is called the Galerie Intemporelle, and it's very, very close to the Pompidou Center, which is the Center of Contemporary Art. And her gallery is devoted almost exclusively to art of the African diaspora. She has focused on painters from the Caribbean, from Cuba, from Martinique, and other places. And among the artists whom she currently handles is the photographer Frank Stewart, who is the official photographer for the Jazz in Lincoln Center, and has done a book of photographs on Buford Delaney, a book of photographs on the director of the Lincoln Center Orchestra, and so on. So in her work, her gallery, of course, is perhaps the continual contact with the African diaspora that people in Paris can check on and would be interested in.